So earlier I told you that using the font size property, we can change the size of our font. Now here we can type an absolute value like 20 pixels or a relative value. But as a general rule of thumb, you should forget about pixels for setting font size because pixels are not consistent across devices. For example, Apple devices like Mac computers and phones allow pixels to be smaller so they can fit more pixels on the screen. That's why everything looks very sharp on these devices. This is called Retina display technology. So we cannot rely on pixels as a consistent form of measurement across devices. You might be on a Windows computer and think 20 pixels for the body text is great, but if you view that page on a Mac computer, your text is going to look smaller. That is the problem with pixels. So here we want to use a relative unit. Now, what are these relative units? Do you remember? Let's quickly recap. We have percentages, viewport unit, and ems and rems. Generally speaking, the common best practice for setting the font size is using the rem unit. So we want to set this to 1 rem, which means 1 times the font size of the root element. That is the HTML element. Now, what is the font size of the HTML element? Well, here we don't have a rule for the HTML element, so the font size will be based on the user setting. Earlier, I told you that in Chrome, we can go to Preferences and search for font size. Now look, the default font size is set to medium, which is 16 pixels. But people with a poor vision sometimes change this to large or very large. So, assuming that most users don't change the setting, the default font size here is 16 pixels. Now, we don't want to explicitly set this because this will prevent the user from changing the default font size in the browser. So I'm just typing this here so we know the font size of the HTML element is 16 pixels by default. And that means when we set the font size of the body text to 1 rem, it's going to be 16 pixels. Now, what if the font size was something like 1.5? Well, calculating 1.5 times 16 pixels is a little bit complicated, right? So earlier I showed you a technique. If we set the font size of the HTML element to 62.5%, that means 62.5% of 16 pixels. So that is equivalent to 10 pixels. So when we say font size of the body text is 1.5 rem, that means 15 pixels. It just makes calculations easier. So I'm going to change this back to 1 rem. Now, some people prefer to use 62.5% here. Other people prefer to use 100%. This is completely subjective. There's no right or wrong. What matters here is that by using relative units for setting the font size, we can easily make our text responsive with very little code. So our text will look great on various screen sizes. Let me show you. So for our body, we're going to use 1 rem. And for H1, we're going to use 2 rems. So we are assuming these values are for mobile devices. That is the mobile first approach. Now, for tablets or desktop devices, we want to write a media query and increase the font size. We can achieve that with very little code. So I'm going to define a media query for screens that are minimum of, let's say, 400 pixels. That's just an arbitrary number. Now here I'm going to define a rule for the HTML element and set the font size to a value larger than 100%. We can set it to 130%. Now, because we're using relative units everywhere, like over here or over here, the font for all these elements will get bigger automatically. Let's save the changes. So back in the browser, this is the text size for a desktop computer. But if you resize the window to simulate a mobile device, our text gets smaller. See? We achieve this with very little code. So the common best practice is to set the font size relative to the HTML element. Now, how big should our headings be? Well, if you go to type-scale.com, you can see a visualization of the text at various sizes. This is really helpful in finding the right font size for different headings. For example, if you're happy with what you see here, you can use this value as the font size of the H1 element. Similarly, you can use this value as the font size of the H2 element and so on. So we have H1, H2, H3, and so on. Now on the left, you can change the settings. So our base size is set to 16 pixels. Here we have various scales like major third, perfect fourth, and so on. if we change the scale, our text gets larger or smaller at a different ratio, okay? Now, we can also change the Google font. So here we're using Open Sans, but we can use any of the fonts available in Google to get a good preview on the right side. We can also change the weight. So I'm going to set it to 700, which represents bold. So if we use these font sizes, our headings are going to look exactly like what we see here. So I'm going to grab this number and use it as the font size for our H1 element. Now below that, I'm going to define a rule for our H2 elements and set the font size to this other value. Let's paste it here. Now to preview this, back to our markup, I'm going to add another heading here. Let's say heading 2 and heading 1. Here's what we get. Now, of course, I've zoomed in here. That's why the text looks bigger than what you saw. But I want you to notice the difference between the font of heading 1 and heading 2. Our heading 1 element is using a serif font because here we have those lines or strokes. But our heading 2 is using a sans serif font. The reason this is happening is because for our body text, we set the font family to the system font stack, and then we overrode the font for H1 elements. But we want to make sure that all our headings have the same font. So H1, H2, and so on. So to fix this problem, we have to separate the font family and font size properties in this rule. Because if you apply the other element selectors here, their font will be set to the same size. This is not what we want. So I'm going to define another set of rules for setting the font size for various headings. Then I'm going to move the font family property here. So using this technique, we set the font for all headings, and then we define individual rules for setting the font size for different headings. Now, save the changes back in the browser. Both our headings are using a serif font. So whenever you want to start a new project, I highly encourage you to go to typescale.com and find the right size for your headings.